2:20 on February 2nd, 2020.
Well, good. Okay, I'm going to say it too. Okay, here we go. Welcome to Disclosure Network, New York. Today is Sunday, February 2nd, 2020. I'm Nick Curto, DNNY Director and Co-Founder. DNNY is a grassroots organization now celebrating our 18th year of providing 2 meetings per month throughout the year in Manhattan. We focus on cutting-edge UFO, ET issues, paranormal phenomenon, as well as many related, very important subjects that are in the back of the mainstream headlines. In other words, who or what is pulling the strings? Our members do intensive investigative research into these various topics and share that information with our group, either at our meetings or on the internet, and we have a lot of internet followers on YouTube. Our motto right from day one is, quote, connecting the dots to seek truth, unquote. We have available to everyone worldwide a DNNY News Blast email service focusing on the cutting edge topics of special interest. This service is totally free. Just visit our website, dnny.info, and type in your email address and click to send. You'll be connected with our group, and you'll be getting emails on the most cutting-edge subjects you could possibly imagine. You can also email me if you have findings, and I will look at that and also put them on so all of our members will have that to look at too. And we appreciate your input on that. Now then, here we go. Our featured guest speaker for today's meeting is Mark Sokol from New Jersey. A very warm welcome to you, Mark.
Thank you.
Let's give him a hand. Now, a very quick bit about Mark's professional background. Mark is a self-taught physicist and engineer with a knack for out-of-the-box thinking. He started a company refurbishing hybrid batteries and designed and built the equipment to do it himself. His hands-on approach with electricity inspired him to investigate advanced propulsion and conversion in his machine body shop into high-powered anti-gravity research facility. His website is www.falconhybrid.org.
Falconspace.org.
What?
Falconspace.org.
Oh, okay. Okay. Why don't you say it again? Go ahead. You say it.
It's falconspace.org.
Okay. Oh, was it changed?
There must be a
No?
mistake.
Okay. Anyhow. All right. So I would like to ask you first, if I may, Mark, just a few background questions so our audience just has a little bit of idea about that, and then we'll get into your talk. So if I may, first, where were you born?
I was born in Lakewood, New Jersey.
Okay, a Jersey boy. And were you from a large family or just a...
So I'm number 9 out of 11.
Whoa!
Yes.
Wow!
Yeah.
Did you get to the table first occasionally?
It was very chaotic. My mom would just go to sleep at 7 and fend for ourselves. So I learned how to cook.
Wow, that's incredible. And were you the youngest or the oldest or in between?
I'm number 9, so I'm from the youngest.
Oh, okay. And did you your family stay in New Jersey with pretty much during your life, or did your family move around?
So they lived in Lakewood until September 11th, 2001, and my dad was on a plane coming back from Israel, and the plane turned around because the airspace was closed, and he decided it was a sign from God, we have to move to Israel, and we moved like 2 weeks later to the old city of Jerusalem. So I lived there for a couple of years too.
Wow. And also, just very briefly, your schooling?
Pretty much all of my schooling relates to the Hebrew Bible and Talmud and all that stuff. And everything that's anti-gravity related or science related, I'm self-taught.
And how did you get interested in this amazing subject? Do you remember how that all started?
So it was like a sliding scale. It started off with trying to figure out what Judaism was. And then I realized that Judaism was alien worship, at which point what is an alien, what makes them special? The answer is anti-gravity. The only difference between us and them is anti-gravity. They have the technology, we don't. That's the defining that's the definition of an alien, really. So I started getting into anti-gravity, started reading any book I could find on Amazon. Most of everything that's out there is disinformation. It's the most disinformation section of ufology because it's the holy grail of ufology. There's nothing that's more important in ufology than anti-gravity. Because as soon as you have a flying saucer and you're flying around, there's nothing to disclose anymore. You don't have to look for lights in the sky. You're in the light in the sky. So that's why I started to focus on what I think is the most important thing. And I think it's decades overdue.
That's amazing already, and certainly I've got like 1,000 questions already, but I'm sure they do too. So let's go right to your topic today. You picked a short history of anti-gravity research, so please take it away.
Okay, so first of all, you see this picture over here of Falcon Space. Just so you know, there is no company named Falcon Space. There's no LLC or anything. It's just a logo, and it's a dream. You got a picture next to the Falcon of a flying saucer. By anti-gravity, I mean how those things work. The reason why I went with Falcon is because Sokol, my last name, in Russian means falcon, so it's like Sokol Space, kind of cool. Advancing anti-gravity technology is the mission, and even if we were to try all these experiments and everything were to be a failure, so long as we publish the results, that is advancing anti-gravity technology, because now people know what doesn't work. Okay, so let's start. First question. What is gravity? Does anybody have any clue? Anybody?
Well, I don't know. I see it from my own thinking, which may be incorrect. Gravity is an energy that either has a positive or a negative effect.
We only see a pulling force in gravity. It's possible there is a pushing force, but Earth, you can see, is round, and objects that are pulled together tend to go to their lowest energy state, which is the sphere. So that's something to remember. The history of gravity goes like this. There's 4 known forces in nature, and I write known because there may be more that we don't know about at this time. Gravity extends to infinity. Is there a graviton, a smallest particle? We don't know for sure. It's been theorized, but it's never been observed. Electromagnetism has the photon as its base particle, and it also extends to infinity. And this is an energy, a force that we're very familiar with. The weak nuclear force is typified with W and Z bosons. It extends to less than the diameter of a proton. These are extremely small forces. And the strong gluon force extends to 1 femtometer, which is even smaller. It's a very, very weak force. Gravity is a fundamental physical force that is responsible for interactions that occur between aggregations of matter, such as stars and planets, and between particles, such as photons as well. Light is affected by gravity. That is 10 to the negative 38 times the strength of the strong force, and that it extends over infinite distances. So if the strong force equaled 1, gravity would be 0 point, all those zeros, and then 1. That's how weak gravity is compared to all the other forces. Although it's the force that we feel, on a day-to-day basis, it's only because of the size of the Earth that we're able to actually feel it. Basics in the discovery of gravity. First, Copernicus in 1543. Keep in mind, there's only like 650 years ago, just realized that the sun is the center of the solar system. And that was heresy. John Kepler came along with some more heresy and said that the planets are going around the sun too in the 1600s. And then Newton finally figured out the math and had published his universal law of gravitation in 1686. Gravity, as we all know, follows an inverse square relationship with force and distance. So every time you go out one distance, the strength of the gravitic field goes down by half. First measurement of gravitational forces was by Henry Cavendish in the 1790s. Does anyone know what the force of gravity is on Earth? Oh, no. It's quantified as 9.8 meters per second. So every second you have an acceleration of 9.8 meters. So if you ever got into a Tesla and put it into extreme mode and pushed on the pedal so that it would go forward 9.8 meters per second, you'd feel 1 G of force pulling you back, because gravity is indistinguishable from an acceleration. and a deceleration for that matter too.
Is there slightly different gravitational forces in different parts of our Earth?
Oh yeah, for sure. Even when the moon and the sun are overhead, that changes gravitational forces because they pull you upward.
Oh,
That's why there's tides.
of course, right.
The high and the low tides. When Sandy came here, that was the biggest tide of the month because it was the new moon, and the sun and the moon were on the other side of the Earth, pulling all the Earth and pulling the water less. So you had a super high tide, and then you had the wind and everything like that.
Interesting. Thank you.
And different parts of the planet have different strengths. And the weakest gravitational force on Earth is around the equator. And I think the strongest is probably toward the poles because you have the centrifugal force of the planet pulling you outward as well. There's a lot of forces at play, but you're not probably going to notice them unless you have extremely sensitive equipment. Okay, Newton's theory of gravitation. It's basically a piece of math. The force equals to the gravitational constant, which is a number that was only discovered later, and times one mass times the other mass divided by the distance between the two objects. So in this equation, if you want to figure out what your force would be, you really want to just measure the mass of the Earth because your gravitational pull on the planet is inconsequential. It worked really well for launching satellites into space. Like this math worked out perfect, but it lacked an explanation for the exact rate of Mercury's perihelion precession. I'll explain what that is. Every planet has a point in its orbit where it's the closest to the Earth, closest to the Sun. That's called the perihelion. Earth's perihelion is on January 4th, actually. Mercury's perihelion, though, keeps on changing. Every time it orbits, it changes a little bit. Most of that has to do with the pull and tug of Venus and Earth and Mars, probably, on Mercury's orbit. But the explanation that Newton gave, with his equation, couldn't equate for a small percentage of the perihelion precession, which was only calculated several hundred years later. So when he came up with his math, he didn't even know that this was the case. Einstein came along and had his theory of general relativity. It says that gravity is a deformation in space-time. Gravity is therefore an apparent force. It's not really a force because the space-time is curving, and it gets into all that. The math breaks down to the same equation Newton got, plus this one, which you see over here. Basically, they added a R3, which is the distance of the planet from the sun, or the distance of a object from a stronger gravitational field, times 3. And for most planets, that equals to 0, or rounds to 0 because of their distance. But for Mercury, it actually changed the equation a little bit, and that correctly, using this equation, they were able to calculate the correct orbit of Mercury's perihelion precession. With a little bit of a fudge factor. This is very complex math, and it was done by hand at first, in the early 20th century. The theory also correctly stated that electromagnetic waves would be affected by gravity. So I'm sure you all are aware of how Einstein's theory was proven through an eclipse in the early 20th century. It was right after World War I believe. And they saw that the starlight would curve around the sun, and everyone took that as a verification of his theory. Well, he is correct that electromagnetic waves are affected by gravity. Tesla's dynamic theory of gravity. Tesla hated Einstein's whole concept. He claimed to have completed a dynamic theory of gravity that would put an end to idle speculation and false conceptions as to that of curved space. The theory was developed initially between 1892 and 1894. During the period, he was conducting experiments with high-frequency, high-potential electromagnetism. Remember that, because that's going to be important for later. And completed it in 1937. It was never published. Tesla's theory was supposed to explain gravity using electrodynamics. Something that he stated that's very telling is there's no energy in matter other than that received from the environment, which is the ether. The Wikipedia page on Tesla's dynamic theory of gravity has been taken down. But since it's never really been published, that everything on there was probably just theory anyways. DTG is dynamic theory of gravity. Okay, the quantum theory of gravity. This was put together by a friend of mine, Todd DeCiotto. Particles are vibrations in the zero-point field. He believes in a zero-point field or an ether, an underlying energy field that we can't directly detect, but it's there. And they are energies that are bouncing in and out of existence against this zero-point field. It's also known as Dirac particles. So large quantities of particles bouncing against the zero-point field would cause the zero-point field to become more elastic and less coherent, such as the Earth. Think of a whole bunch of balls bouncing against two walls. It would put pressure against the two walls to try to separate them a bit. Particles want to go to their lowest possible energy state, and that is gravity. A ball bouncing between two plates is a good analogy of this effect. So on the bottom left, you see a ball bouncing between two parallel plates. It's not moving anywhere. That's energy at rest. Versus if you have two plates and one of them are, coming toward Earth, and Earth is a huge mass of matter, and it's acting like these Dirac particles pushing against the zero-point field. It would sort of elongate it a little bit, and all the particles that are out in space would be attracted toward Earth. That's his way of thinking of it, which may be a very valid way of looking at it. We're going to get into that later. The electrogravity theory, this I made up with a friend of mine, and it's also based on Alzafan's work. I have his paper here if anyone's interested. Basically, we're stating that all particles are electromagnetic fields of different shapes, sizes, directions, and spins. So we're trying to say that all four forces in nature are really just electromagnetism at different distances with different spins and directions and shapes and sizes. And they're like electromagnetism spun in on each other. Particles radiate an electromagnetic field that spreads to infinity in different directions, orientations, and spins. The intensity of that field is what dictates the particle's mass. So basically all the particles are emanating out this energy field, which is the gravitic field that goes out to infinity, and the amount of energy that they radiate determines their actual mass. Since all matter is interconnected and nature likes to achieve equilibrium, for an attractive force equilibrium is a sphere, electrogravity is a result. Surface tension of water is a good analogy, except that it only interacts on a molecular level as opposed to infinity. Now keep that in mind. You're going to see a video about surface tension right now.
Welcome to the International Space Station. I'm NASA astronaut Ricky Arnold. Our view from the ISS of Earth is absolutely magnificent, but we quickly realized we really should call it planet Ocean. We are mostly a water planet. Water occurs here in all three phases, solid, liquid, and gas. And the presence of water on other planets and moons within our own solar system has us wondering, is there life there too? Well, why is water so special? One reason is called surface tension. So what is surface tension? Let's have a look. Surface tension is a property of liquids in which molecules of one substance are more attracted to each other than to molecules of another substance. Water is unique in that it has a high surface tension compared to other liquids. This is due to its polar property. The positive hydrogen ends and the negative oxygen ends create a strong bond. As they say, opposites attract, so the hydrogen end of the water tends to stick to the oxygen end in a nearby water molecule. At water's surface, its molecules are only attracted to the water molecules below and to the sides of them, as there is only air above these molecules, so the surface molecules of a body of water are pulled down, creating a more stable, stronger environment.
What does the view look like from inside a water bubble? Astronauts on the International Space Station studying how water behaves in space submerged a sealed GoPro video camera inside a ball of water.
3, 2, 1. Oh, we made it out the other side.
little too hard.
That is wild.
I think it's going to stay in now.
The experiment was to better understand the phenomenon of water's surface tension in a microgravity environment, which causes water to form a bubble that floats around in space.
Pull out quickly. Oh, dude.
This is going to get worse and worse.
Refilm it.
Dude, this is amazing. Look at that. Whoa. Holy smokes. Oh my gosh.
That is absolutely fascinating.
So electrogravity and the quantum theory of gravity both disagree with general relativity about space-time curvature, and agree with special relativity, which is speed of light and time dilations and all that stuff, and add an explanation for gravity while unifying all the forces. And they also explain why light is affected by gravity, because if gravity is an electromagnetic force in nature, then it stands to reason that other electromagnetic forces, such as photons, will be affected by them. Or if we go with the whole Dirac particle with the quantum theory of gravity, they would also be attracted to their lowest energy state, which would be falling toward a gravitic field. Both offer ways to affect gravity or create artificial gravity. And those are the most important points. So what is anti-gravity? Anybody have any clue?
Something that, a force that would repel the gravitational forces and set whatever that is free within that space. It's not adhering to gravitational pull.
That's one possibility. You can create a gravity shield, for instance. Another option is to create inertial mass shielding. What if you can just get rid of inertial mass? Why is there inertial mass in the first place? We don't know. So if you can get rid of either the gravity field or the inertial mass field, doing 90-degree turns at 10,000 miles an hour wouldn't be a mystery anymore, which is what we see with flying saucers. But really what this question is about is what is causing these flying saucers to operate the way they do. How do they work?
So what you were also saying is that not only is gravity pulling us towards the Earth, but also there's other forces that are also acting upon us at the same time. You mentioned the moon. There may be other forces also?
That's very, very possible, yes. Well, one theory of anti-gravity is warp drive. So everyone who's familiar with Star Trek knows the Phoenix was the first craft to break the light barrier. And then what happened next? The aliens landed. What was their names? From Spock. What planet did he come from? Vulcan, right? Oh yeah, the Vulcans. The Vulcans landed, and it was the great showing. It was after World War III, apparently. But anyways, according to Einstein's general relativity, gravity is a warp in space-time caused by matter. It'd be theoretically possible to warp space in front of a craft using negative matter, and the craft would surf on a continuous wave of warp space. The problem is the standard model of particle physics does not include negative matter. And on the bottom left, you can see the Alcubierre warp drive that's been theorized. And he at first said that it would take about a Jupiter worth of mass of negative matter to create this effect. And then they later did some math equations and said it would actually take only a couple hundred kilo. The problem is that we don't have any negative matter. We've never made it. So I give that theory a big X. Not happening. Anyone familiar with Bob Lazar?
Oh yeah, we've talked about that, yeah.
Bob Lazar. Okay, so My theory on Bob Lazar is that he actually saw a real spacecraft and was given a BS explanation on how it works. But this is how he claims it works. So he claimed to have worked on reverse engineering alien spacecraft at S4 near Area 51. He actually brought Area 51 to the limelight. And this is how we found out about it, through this guy. Propulsion is achieved by amplifying the gravity wave of element 115 and using that to direct the craft. The energy is produced by hitting element 115 with a proton, which makes it into element 116, which is antimatter, which then interacts with a gas that turns into pure heat energy, which then converts to electrical energy using a 100% efficient thermoelectric converter. Did anyone understand that? Do you want to understand that?
Yeah.
Really?
I've read
Because it's
that
bullshit.
before.
Okay.
I've read that before. It's like,
Okay, you know what I'm talking about here, okay?
Yeah.
Bottom line is, element 115 is not stable, and element 116 is not antimatter. It's a great theory, it's a great story, and a lot of people bought into it. Jeremy Rice, alien scientist, who has a huge YouTube following, really loved this idea when he first heard about it when he was a kid, and then later figured out that it really made absolutely no sense in the field. And he's been bashing Bob Lazar with like a religious zeal. I try to stop him sometimes because just negative attention is also positive attention. You heard that phrase before. His story is also widely available online and shows up prominently in search results. So what does that tell you about this? Bullshit.
no bullshit.
Right. But something that he said is very telling when he was giving over the story of his, viewing the craft. He threw out some stuff of what he saw that were very telling, and I'm going to play a little clip.
Also, that's almost a byproduct of the reactor. The reactor also sets up a gravitational wave from the 115 being bombarded. This gravitational wave is present at the top of the reactor and is essentially guided in the same way microwaves are guided through tuned tubes. And this goes to their amplifying cavities and through the projectors that are in the bottom of the craft.
So he's talking about microwaves being guided through tuned tubes.
Yeah. I read something, he got some of that idea from what the Germans...
It's possible.
Yeah.
But tuned tubes and microwaves were probably at the base of the craft. And we have a good theory as to why.
Okay, people, if you keep your comments, wait till we have a Q&A. Don't do it now because you're not near a microphone, and you have to understand that the mic's right here. So not do it, okay? Go ahead.
Okay, so Q thruster. This is was invented by Roger Scheuer. Actually, it's Robert Scheuer as an M drive in 2005, I believe it was. A cone-shaped copper chamber is filled with microwave radiation, and it develops a thrust. They theorize that it interacts with the quantum vacuum fluctuations or the zero-point field, which is why they call it a Q thruster, quantum thruster. Sony White of NASA EagleWorks laboratory observed thrusts of 1 to 20 newtons per kilowatt, even while using a Faraday cage and a vacuum chamber. Top right picture, that is NASA's EagleWorks lab replicating this experiment. We know China's been working on this. Many countries have been working on this. It's very low thrust levels, but there is thrust. It's reactionless thrust. There is nothing coming out, and it's creating a propulsion. NASA's team results have not been published in a peer-reviewed journal at this moment. That's what's going on with Q thrusters. Another theory on how to do this is inertial mass gravity shielding. And there's various methods that have been proposed, including dynamic nuclear orientation, where we're trying to orient the nucleus of the atom toward one spin, so that all of the spins are in one axis. Nuclear magnetic resonance, which is similar to MRI machine, which is supposed to create a similar effect. Rotating superconductors, which also would create like a Bose-Einstein condensate, where there is no electric potential allowed inside of a superconductor because it's superconducting, and if you attach a magnetic field to that, then you get everything rotating at one axis, and if you spin it, then you might see some weight loss. And then there's the Searle effect generator, which claims to do something like this, and it's also a zero-point energy device, which I'm not too familiar with, but I'll show you some stuff about that as well. So first we'll start off with dynamic nuclear orientation. This is something we're actually working on at the moment. So the spin state of the electrons' Larmor frequency is energized in a strong static and laminar magnetic field using gigahertz frequency range RF. So the Larmor frequency is the precessional rate of a spin. Earth has a precession. It's around every 25,000 years we precess. The pole of the Earth does a full, no, not the pole, the axis of the Earth does a full circle in the sky, and it's said to be connected to climatic effects on the Earth as well. But everything that's spinning has its own Larmor frequency, which is the spin of the axis. If you had a gyroscope, you'd see its axis spinning around. It's the Larmor frequency. So we're not able to energize the electrons directly at their spin rate, which is the speed of light, but we are able to energize them in the gigahertz range at their Larmor frequency. The gigahertz RF is shut off for several milliseconds, and then the energized electrons radiate their energy to the core of the atom, transferring over their coherency or their orientation, which is always being maintained by the magnetic field. The magnetic field is nothing more than a electrical orientation of electrons. So you're keeping the electrons oriented in the same spin, and you're trying to orient the subatomic particles that are underneath them. Gigahertz RF is then turned back on, and the cycle repeats itself.
Okay.
So the status of the experiment. So we've acquired several pieces of equipment to try this experiment, including the following. A gigahertz RF signal generator with pulse capability. This was NATO military surplus, and there's a good possibility that this piece of equipment was used to study anti-gravity 50 years ago. So that's how old this is. We're talking about technology that's so old that I'm buying scrap equipment and I'm able to replicate it, and we're still in the dark about this stuff. That's how old this stuff is. We also got the proper connectors and a high gain waveguide. You see that tube on top, the green tube. That is a waveguide to control where the RF frequency goes. And similar to what Bob Lazar talked about, that's the same thing that was in the base of his craft as well. So it's very possible we're on the right track with this. We also have a Gauss meter, a metal smelting furnace to manufacture samples, because according to the Alzaphan experiment paperwork, you need to use a special mixture of iron and aluminum as your hull of the craft, because the iron maintains the magnetic field and allows it to permeate deeper into the aluminum, and the aluminum has a stronger connection between the electrons and the subatomic particles in the core of the atom. And he claimed that you had to have extremely pure aluminum, which we got, 5.9 pure aluminum. They claim to have replicated this experiment in 1994, and they got around, it was 80% weight loss in a 1 gram sample. It was done in the basement of a university. Some of the equipment to make the laminar magnetic field was extremely expensive, and the university wanted it back upstairs, meaning. And rather than tell them the truth that they just discovered anti-gravity, they decided to fight over who owns what in a company that never existed, and it all went down with ego. So that's what happened with that experiment. And then, he ended up passing away in 2012. His son wrote a book about it. It's available on Amazon, Anti-Gravity with Present Technology, and the paper is free for anyone who wants. I have a copy of it over here. You can read it. We also have a hanging scale, which is very important. It gives us live information on a live weight on a laptop computer. And we also have a room-sized Faraday cage to protect ourselves from the experiment. Something that's very interesting about these gigahertz frequencies is that this is the same frequency level that we're talking about with the 5G networks that are now coming up.
We've been talking a lot about 5G and smart meters lately, believe me.
Yes, so it's kind of interesting that the two coincide. I'm not saying that anti-gravity is safe by any means. You wouldn't want to be in the wash of a 747's, engine. They're very dangerous, and there's a reason why airports are set up like that. So I imagine if this actually worked and we're be flying around in these craft one day, airports will start looking more like Faraday cages with protective measures so that you don't get the RF inside the building.
I know that some people have those meters, and they took them near their microwaves as they were cooking food, and they were shocked to find that their microwaves weren't protecting them totally at all, that there was definitely the meter readings away from the microwave ovens, which is shocking and a little bit disturbing, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, you got to really worry about with gigahertz frequencies is like if you're getting into the the exact frequency of molecules of water. That can be very dangerous, but it has to be exact. If you're plus or minus even 0.1%, it's not going to work at all. So you need very exact equipment to know exactly what you're looking at also. And this little piece of equipment there on the bottom, underneath that little black box over there, is really an astounding piece of equipment. It's exactly what we needed for this experiment. It's the only one I ever found, and I found it exactly when I was looking for it, after I found out about this theory, in the exact 9 to 9.5 gigahertz range, and it allows you to pulse the sample, which is very important.
The equipment that you're using, Mark, is it something that you were renting, or are you buying it, or how is this working?
Okay, so we're going to get into that in the next slide. Everything over in that picture we currently own. This is all used equipment, except for the wires. I think those are new. So what we need to complete this experiment, we need a static laminar magnetic field. I have a buddy of mine in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who will be able to put this together for $500. We're looking at around a 200 watt gigahertz amplifier, which costs around $1,500. Brand new, those cost around $100,000. And an RF detector, I haven't done that much research, but the only one I found that's in the right frequency that really gives you a full readout costs around $3,500. So maybe there's a possibility to rent that. I don't know, but such a detector will have dual use. If you wanted to see what the 5 gigahertz system is putting out, that will be a very valuable asset for that as well.
Are there any universities or colleges that use this equipment, and perhaps they have funding to buy new equipment and they could sell their old equipment? Have you ever looked into that part?
I have looked into that. Usually all that equipment ends up on eBay, so that's usually where we end up going. We'll get into where universities are at with anti-gravity. They're not very keen on talking to anybody who discusses anti-gravity, and that kind of has to do with the secrecy that surrounds this entire subject. It's the most there's more disinformation in this field and more cover-up than in any other field of ufology, because it's
not surprising at all.
Because it's the holy grail of ufology. Because once you have a flying saucer in your garage, there's nothing to disclose anymore.
Right, and some of the universities and colleges, don't they get funding
yes.
to do this research? And there must be clauses in there that they can't.
And we'll get to that clause in a little bit. Yes.
Okay, good. You got it covered, my friend.
So nuclear magnetic resonance, I'm not too familiar with this, but basically it's similar to an MRI machine. What they do in an MRI machine is they orient all the electrons in your body using a very powerful magnetic field, which is superconducting magnetic field. The RF is in the megahertz range, and it flips the cores of the atom back and forth. This is done with hydrogen atoms. So they're flipping it back and forth, and they energize it, and then they turn off the megahertz range, and it radiates out a megahertz signal in proportion to how many hydrogen atoms there are. So they're able to see exactly what's going on inside your body using this system. Energized core transfers. The theory is that if you did that with larger particles, it would actually create a orientation in the core of the atom, which will in turn nullify the mass or shield you from gravity. And the megahertz RF is turned back on, and the cycle repeats. This is a short video showing how there's different energy states to matter, how they can be affected by RF frequencies. The music is very well situated with the visual. You'll notice that. This is what we were talking about earlier. that phase now because the waves are not the same height. Now they're getting to become the same size as the particle, and it starts to affect it.
So that green wave we're seeing on the screen is energizing that red particle.
Exactly. Now it's showing you that the particle is actually not in a vacuum, it's actually with other particles, so they affect it as well. The green wave was the electromagnetic wave that was hitting it. That's in the megahertz range.
Wow.
This is for a core of the atom. When you turn it off, eventually everything comes down to zero again, flatlines out.
Will it hit a certain level where it can't be energized anymore?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
One great way to look at it is that it's spinning, and then you can have it spin opposite to its orientation. That's the high energy state. Okay, so the status of this experiment is we have a researcher in South Carolina, that's Todd DiCiotto, currently working on this experiment. I'm trying to encourage him as much as I can, and it seems like he's never done anything other than theory until now, which is fine, but he's written several papers, and I have one of them here, very well written. He has all the math laid out, and he believes that the gigahertz way of trying this out will work as well, but his theory is, if you can do it in the megahertz range, lower frequencies are better for us. Let's do it in the megahertz range. So we're trying both at the same time. Rotating superconductors. This is another way we had to negate inertial mass. Superconductor is, of course, an object that has no resistance whatsoever. They're usually cooled down to extremely cold temperatures. YCBO, or yttrium copper barium titanate, oxide, is one of the highest temperature superconductors that we've been using. Eugene Podklanov, when he was doing an experiment using superconductors, noticed that someone in the laboratory was smoking a pipe, and the pipe smoke rose in a column above the superconducting disk. So he noticed something strange. He placed a ball-shaped magnet above the disk attached to a balance, and the balance behaved strangely. And then he substituted it with a non-magnetic material, silicon, and still the balance was acting very strange. We found that any object above the disk lost some of its weight, and we found that if we rotated the disk, the effect was increased. So, the basics of rotating superconductors. A magnetic field is applied to the spinning superconductor with the field lines oriented with the axis of the superconductor's spin. According to Ning Li, she's also one of the nasty people, this creates a Bose-Einstein condensate, resulting in a very strong gravomagnetic field, producing a strong repulsive force. Ning Li is up there in the top right. She's in the center between the two scientists, and that little black disc, over there, is actually one of the largest superconducting discs ever made. I don't know how they made it so big. There's a lot of problems with making superconducting discs that large that they break. They managed to make a very large one, and she got a grant for like $500,000. In 1993, Ning Li claimed to have a functional anti-gravity device using this method. However, in 1997, she published a paper describing an experiment that showed the effect was very small, if it existed at all. Ning Li has since disappeared, and nobody can get in touch with her, not responding to emails or anything. Podklanov, who was the original discoverer of this effect, claims that she is now working for the Department of Defense and has been in sporadic contact with her. We're not working on replicating this experiment at this time.
Why not?
Well, do you want to try it? Get me a superconducting disk, we'll do it. The Searle effect generator. So this is an all-in-one zero-point field, free energy device and anti-gravity machine. And it gets very cold when the energy is removed from the device. It's built using layers of copper, iron magnets, Teflon, and non-magnetic neodymium, and it also uses high voltage DC. And all these little spinners are spinning around, and the high voltage DC is applied somehow, and it's a free energy device, and it's also anti-gravity machine. I have no theory about how this could possibly work, and I've never seen it work. But this is essentially Searle's wet dream about the big machine that he's going to build one day. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
Mark, describe what we're seeing, please.
I'm not really sure what we're saying. There's iron in there, there's Teflon in there, there's neodymium non-magnetized, and they're basically, all the magnetic fields are oriented in a way that they affect one another. So the outer ones are coils, those are electromagnets, and they're affecting the inner ones and make it all spin together. I have no clue why this would possibly work and if it works at all, but this is the video they put out, so I thought it was interesting.
You know, I'm seeing the 3 rings that this is based on. We're looking at that.
You don't need 3 rings. It can be done with 1 or 2.
But just that what we're looking at, though, reminds me of an ancient city that was exactly built like that. It was in 3 rings, and the landmass and all the homes and all the different everything was around that, and it was on water. And it just struck me when I saw this. It just happened to look similar to that.
Very interesting.
I have to look it up. I can't. But yeah, it's a very interesting archaeological find, and there's a lot about that on the internet. Okay, go ahead.
So,
by the way, we got about a half an hour total, so I don't want you to rush it. But if we hit the half hour when we have to leave, we can.
That's fine. We're almost done here.
We're all, okay. And then we can do a Q&A.
Yeah, for sure.
Great. Okay.
So the status of the experiment: we have a team in Vietnam currently working on this experiment. His name is Nam Tran. Since I've gone public with all my anti-gravity experiments, more and more people are coming out of the woodworks, and I'm encouraging them to go as public as possible. The reason being is that the more public you are and the more people know about you, the less likely they are to come after you. Anyone who's been secretive about this stuff, and he's the only one who knows, all it takes is a bullet to put an end to that. But as soon as we're teaching everybody about anti-gravity, showing experiments that work, stuff that don't work, it's very important to have more and more people involved. The initial results of his experiment, this is his Searle effect generator. I think there's only 4 rollers over there. Look pretty positive with a 3-gram weight loss, but we need to verify that the scale is not being affected by the magnetic or high voltage DC fields. So I recommended he also have an object hanging above it and see if there's any weight loss in something that's hanging above it, or if he can remove any energy from it. I think he put this away already. This guy is also an aircraft engineer, and he thinks he's working on obsolete technology, and he uses his their little maker's shop at the airport's airplane refurbishment lab to do his anti-gravity experiments. I thought it was pretty interesting. Electrogravitics. So this is a term that was coined in 1920s by the discoverer of the effect, Thomas Townsend Brown. It's widely been criticized as a known force called electrohydrodynamics, or ion wind. Later experiments claim to have eliminated the ion wind, and the effect strengthens. Any engineerable method of anti-gravity will likely be using electricity, so the term electrogravitics, even though it's been taken by Thomas Townsend Brown with his gravitator experiments and his high voltage stuff, likely will be a term that will be used in the future and will be reclaimed with another meaning. The gravitator experiment. So he published, this is his earlier work, he published a paper in 1929. It was a patent number 300,311. The gravitator claims to be a method to convert high voltage DC, only above 70,000 volts, into gravitational potential using highly charged parallel plate capacitors. They move in the direction of positively charged plate, and the effect is proportional to the weight of the dielectric, meaning that the heavier the dielectric, the material that doesn't conduct electricity inside the capacitor, the more propulsion force you see. This is not related to the ion wind effect, as the charged plates are completely encapsulated in dielectric materials. So there's no chance of any ion wind affecting it. On the top right, you can see his diagram of what he built. Little pieces of aluminum that were surrounded by glass plates, and then he covered the entire thing with paraffin wax and charged it up to high voltage potentials and observed some movement. Interestingly enough, the base of the ARV, is anyone familiar with Mark McCandlish's ARV picture? The alien reproduction vehicle? The base of it is also a humongous parallel plate capacitor, which might be related to this effect. So, first thing we did was built an ion lifter. You have a 100,000 volt power supply, you gotta build one of these toys. And I made a new design for it. I realized the entire effect has to do with going from a sharp edge to a rounded edge. So what I did was I just made very sharp, thin wires on the top of that straw, and then the base is rounded and connected to the ground.
Today we're doing our first experiment inside the Faraday cage. We're doing a simple charge up of the capacitor.
This is an ear capacitor, so it's possible for ion wind to affect it. This is a diagram from one of Thomas Townsend Brown's papers, so we thought just give it a shot, see what happens. While this was going on, SpaceX was launching the first try of its Falcon Heavy.
Oh.
And right when we finished the experiment, the two boosters landed and everyone was clapping.
We got an overflash. What'd you go up to? There you go. Not what I expected.
You're going to see some bolts of lightning here.
Where are you at now?
Describe what we're seeing.
You're seeing ionic wind moving this object around. Basically, the larger plate to the left is receiving high voltage, and the small copper plate to the right got ground. Now we did a gravitator experiment, which is using a parallel plate capacitor that's completely encapsulated, and I put a smoke stick underneath it just to make sure that there was no wind effect, and yet it was still moving. But in the next couple seconds, you'll see we figured out why it was moving.
Go ahead. Powered up.
So we had two wires, and
Now
high
pull me
voltage creates electrostatic
what's happening.
repulsion. That's what was going on.
Hey guys, we had a little problem with our last experiment. Basically, this thick wire over here kept on getting electrostatic repulsion effects off of the wall and off of the other wire. So I finally put an end to that. I got this 2x1 stick ending with a piece of Teflon. I'm going to cut this off of the gravitator and just have a thin little wire going between it and the gravitator, hanging in the best spot, so that there will be almost no movement on the device from any electrostatic repulsion effects. And we'll see if it still moves.
And
at that point, there's something going on. If it doesn't move at that point, it was all bullshit.
And yeah, it didn't move. After I fixed that last problem, we saw absolutely no movement in the device, and we were able to charge it up to about 70,000 volts. And actually, no, I don't think we got to the 70,000. I think we got around 50 or 60 before there was an electrical breakdown in the glass plates. So this experiment really needs to be tried again. At the full 70,000, probably should put more glass plates in it. But we found another paper by this guy Doyle Buehler, and this paper was actually it's an interesting story about how we came across this paper. You're not going to find it if you Google it. Basically, a friend of mine, Jeremiah, has been doing this quite a bit longer than I have, and there was a company that was investigating anti-gravity, and one of the workers there knew Jeremiah and didn't like the way this company was being so secretive about their information, and gave him the login and password to their server, and he just went in there and took everything, copied it, didn't delete it, but he took everything.
Wow.
And this was one of the papers. It was done by some university. I have the paper here if anyone wants to read it. This is an abstract of the entire paper. I try to make it as short as possible. Experiments were performed with the high voltage single and parallel plate electric capacitors, indicated a net external force acting upon the capacitor mass. The observed tendency was that the charged capacitor consistently moved in the upward direction. However, the force cannot be directly associated with the interaction of the electric and magnetic fields of the Earth. The results were extremely anomalous. It was shown that the upward motion is proportional to the amount of electrical potential energy stored in the electrostatic field of the capacitor, and comparisons are also made to an ionic lifting grid. So they made an ion lifter as well to compare the thrust of the ion lifter to these other things to see if there's any connection. In a Faraday cage, very interesting, the ion model continued to exhibit the force characterized observed earlier, while the capacitors did not exhibit motion of any kind. It didn't work in a Faraday cage, which is very interesting. And we were trying that last experiment inside of a Faraday cage. This strongly indicates that the ion momentum was not the prime cause of the observed effects of for the capacitor. This also implies that the force is not directly caused by the capacitor, but rather an external field such as the electrostatic field of Earth. Therefore, an interaction of the fields of Earth and the capacitor seems to be occurring to produce the force. So there's they theorize that there's some sort of connection between the electrostatic field of Earth. We all know the ionosphere is highly charged, and we're basically living inside of a large capacitor. So maybe there's some connection between having a high potential capacitor and some sort of force that's created. I have no problem with how it works, so long as it gets me to, do 90-degree turns at 10,000 miles an hour. Now, anything that can explain the effect, so we've got to try this out now, right? Mm-hmm. These are the results that he saw. Top right, ion lifter results. You can see they're always between positive and negative 3 grams. The air dielectric capacitor went up to negative 12 grams. The energy versus force observed, there was a direct correlation between the amount of joules stored in the capacitor and the amount of weight loss observed. And finally, on the bottom right, they got a capacitor with a 5 millimeter dielectric, extremely thin dielectric, that was able to hold back 100,000 volts, which is very impressive. That must be a specialized type of glass or something like that, and they had a result of 380 grams of weight loss. So let's do it.
Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Woo. Woo.
Okay, here.
Mark, I got to say that
Now we're doing it.
Oh, there it is. Oh, that's your place, your lab?
This is the lab.
Okay.
First, we're calibrating the equipment.
And this is located in New Jersey, right?
This is located in New Jersey, in the back of a hybrid battery shop. And I sped up like 2.5 weeks of work because we had to let the epoxy cure. I'm mixing epoxy, which is a very good dielectric, with barium titanate, which is a very good material for capacitors because it can store electrostatic energy.
Turn off the sound so we can hear you better, your voices.
Oh yeah, there's not much to hear over here.
It's just music because then we could hear you better talking.
Okay, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So we're mixing 2-part epoxy together, and we're using a scale to measure the 2 parts. We need 100 of one part and 16 of the other part. I'm just trying to give you guys a nitty-gritty look of what it actually means to do an experiment. Everyone just wants to see the final result on a paper, but this is actually what it takes to do this type of stuff. Barium titanate is one of the strongest high K materials. High K meaning that when you apply electrostatic field to it, it acts sort of like a rubber band, that it retains the electrostatic energy and holds it as electrical potential. Every capacitor you have has some sort of high K material in there. Barium titanate is one of the really good ones. There's another one that I wanted to try, calcium copper titan oxide. You need to buy it by the kilo from China. We're warming up the materials to make them less viscous, more liquidy, because they were very thick when I pulled them out. And we're forming a mold right now. This is a piece of molding clay, and I have a little copper disc that we're going to use as the mold material. I called up Jeremiah from Milwaukee at the time also, and we were discussing different methods because he's actually done this before. So here's a sheet of Kapton tape that I'm using to hold everything in place, and cleaning it up, cleaning up the edges. And this is my buddy Jordan. He's going to comb his beard right now.
Looks like you're making a small pizza.
Yeah, we're making a small pizza, and now we're going to start. We pulled them out of the oven. They did become less viscous, more liquidy, and I set up Skype with Jeremiah over there, and mixing in the barium titanate into it, and we did all this by hand. This was just a small batch that I threw together, and I mixed it into both parts of the epoxy. And we got to make sure that that it's completely dissolved. There's no chunks anywhere, and you try to get as much in there as possible so you get the strongest effect. And finally, the second half. And it becomes white as well. Tons of mixing. Finally, adding the two parts together. Once you mix the two parts together, it immediately starts to harden. You have what's called a working time. In this case, it's around 2 or 3 hours before it hardens, and you can't mix it anymore. Then we poured it into the mold. There's actually a part that's not shown over here. To be extra sure that the high voltage is not going to go through it, I put another layer of pure epoxy without the barium titanate on top of this and allow that to cure as well. I stuck it back in the oven to warm it up a little bit so that it becomes less viscous again, and any bubbles, air bubbles that might be inside would be encouraged to leave. Jeremy recommended next time we try using like an agitator, like an orbital sander or something like that, to shake it up. That's a good way of doing it. That's my handy toaster. We didn't need it at home anymore.
Now, what are the settings? You're heating this?
Yeah, we're just warming it up to lower the viscosity so that the material can come out, the air bubbles can come out. And here I am cleaning up the edges of it. I was able to break off whatever I broke off by hand, and then we get a grinder and work on it further. Try to wear a lab coat whenever possible. It's sort of like a gimmick, you know. People trust you more when you're wearing a lab coat for some reason. And the idea was to have a tapered capacitor, so it would be asymmetric. One side is larger than the other. This big square block that you're looking at is made of Teflon, which is also a very strong dielectric material. Dielectric meaning that it opposes electric fields and allows high potential across each side without breakdown. And I got my safety goggles on, and you can see hybrid batteries in the background. I have to move them over in order to make space for all this. This is in the back of a hybrid battery shop. It's like for the Prius or the Camry or whatever. Those are the individual modules for the cells. That's what I do as my day job.
Nice job.
Now we're recycling hybrid batteries for hybrid electric vehicles. That's the final result. And I'm speaking to my buddy over here about the setup, and he recommended that I put the barium titanate side closer to the capacitor plate like that, and we're using good old hot glue as our method of connecting everything together. Now this is what experiments actually look like. You know, they're not that exciting.
Now, are you following any plan from somewhere else, or is this your own research and your own?
Oh, this is definitely my own. Every time.
Yeah, you're really
we're doing something unique, but it's based off of that paper that you saw before, where they promised a result that would be correlated to the strength of the energy held in the capacitor. That's my force sensor, and I have it.
Our setup, we have a high voltage power supply going into a voltage divider, then goes to a parallel plate capacitor, and the ground is connected like that, and we have a force sensor to measure the force put out by the experiment, and that will be read by the computer over here.
You can see the numbers are bouncing around a little bit because ear movements in the area. We allowed it to calm down before we actually started the experiment, but I didn't have a second camera when we did this, so I couldn't get a video of the laptop and a video of the experiment at the same time. I was just looking over at the laptop over my shoulder. And I'm powering up the high voltage power supply that's capable of putting out 125,000 volts.
We see the motion in the unit itself.
The gold box on top is a voltage divider. It's basically a high voltage resistor. And it's a safety feature. It allows us to discharge the capacitor without getting near it. And there's a spark right there on the jumper cable.
75,000 volts. There we go, we're getting breakover. You see what the breakover is? Not yet.
It turns out there was breakover in the jumper cable.
It might be the capacitor charging up. That's breakdown. When was that breakdown? That I don't know. Try again. If I have to guess, it's probably a coronal discharge across the surface on one side, communicating to the surface on the other.
He was wrong on that. It wasn't.
You don't know if ionized air built up
it
on
was
each
the
side
wire.
of the capacitor, it'll start to act as a conductor.
It was the red wire itself,
Dry air,
the insulation of it
air,
breaking down.
30,000 volts per centimeter. When you start getting a chain of ions linked together. It's not like it's coming from there. It may be. But I was seeing sparks on top too. I forgot sparks on the back now.
Yeah, so basically there was a breakdown in the wire.
Which one? The one feeding the load below? The one doing the jump.
And during this experiment, we did not see any results, positive or negative. The voltage didn't go up as high as I had hoped to. It got up to around 70,000 volts. There also was a metal box on top of it that might have played with the the whole Faraday part. That you can't have a Faraday, you can't have the experiment inside of a Faraday cage. So it's definitely an experiment I want to try again. We need to find high voltage cables that are able to maintain 100,000 volts without breaking down like this one did. So the way forward for these experiments is, technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. That's from Stanton Friedman. He's my man. Shout out to Stanton. So we have plans to try another variation of the parallel plate capacitor experiment using pulse charges to rapidly charge the capacitor and monitor for an effect. The pulsed energy will be provided by a bank of capacitors with a heavy-duty CX1538 thyrotron acting as a switch capable of 187 million watt pulses. That's the thyrotron picture over there. I actually have it right here. Anyone wants to see it? This switch over here was specially made for the Berkeley Labs Linear Particle Accelerator and helped discover several elements. This is a piece of history over here that we plan on reusing for anti-gravity experiments. It discovered berkelium and americium in I think the 70s or 80s, and it's really a very interesting piece of technology. So we got to before about universities. Why aren't they doing this research? Well, that's because of the Mansfield Amendment. 1973, restricted research by the Department of Defense for non-military applications. This includes anti-gravity research. This means that most modern anti-gravity research have been outsourced to the private sector and are black budgets. This also means that major universities will not get involved with anything related to anti-gravity. And this is also true for many of the other, MUFON, AlienCon, all the major UFO networks. This is the only network that I've actually come across that was interested in actually talking about this stuff. I applaud you for that. It's a brave move. We tried getting into MUFON to speak when they were here in Cherry Hill, and within minutes of sending the email to the correct party, the guy left MUFON claiming that somebody that MUFON liked was anti-Semitic and yada yada. I had to find that out through contacting him through LinkedIn, and he never got back to me about the anti-gravity speech, and nobody there is talking about it. And if any UFO organization really wants UFO disclosure, they need to concentrate on anti-gravity, because it's the holy grail of ufology, really.
I think that we can all agree to that. Now, is that the last slide?
Not yet. That is the last slide.
We're hitting the last 5 minutes or so I just wanted to let you know.
Okay, so ways to get involved. You can donate time, money, equipment, or supplies. Share with our mission with somebody who has resources to help us out. We need connections in news media in the event that we discover real anti-gravity, because a result in my lab is not going to get us anywhere. You actually need people to pay attention to this and build the real craft. We have a GoFundMe page. You can come to the lab and volunteer. We're at 73 Wagger Road in Hawthorne, New Jersey. That's 20 minutes from the George Washington Bridge.
Okay, could we have the lights on? Okay, well, Mark, we don't have time for a Q&A, so what I'm going to ask the people in the room to do, that if you have questions, email them to me, and then I will share them with you, and we can do it that way, because I know there's a lot of questions in the room. Mark, with the final couple of minutes, could you just give us your thoughts as we leave? What are your thoughts on this? You've already expressed a few things about how important the subject is. Leave us with...
Really, anything anybody can do to help the mission is very important. Time, money, equipment, supplies. Anyone who has any expertise in this area. You mentioned you're an electrician. If you're interested in this stuff, this is life-changing. This is world-changing. This is going to be... As soon as anti-gravity is discovered for real in mainstream, it will become an industry that's bigger than the entire United States economy. We're talking multi-trillion-dollar industry. Airbus and Boeing will tank. SpaceX, which is very heavily invested in rockets, will also tank.
I know that.
Changes. It will be the biggest change in our lifetime. You could be a part of it by helping make this happen.
You're a wonderful educator.
Thank you.
You are, and you've shared some important data with us, and you've made it fathomable to explain it and to understand it, and I can't thank you enough. People here, would you please give Mark an incredible... Mark, I've already asked you if you would come back later when you have more data and you're well along, and please do that. And on behalf of the members of Disclosure Network New York with us today, as well as the YouTube listeners, I just want to thank you again for your exciting and insightful talk today. It was really eye-opening. And I want to invite you back. This is Nick Curto for Disclosure Network New York, wishing you all an enlightened journey as you connect the dots to seek truth. Till next time, keep informed, stay safe, and be kind to one another. Goodbye for now.